Scary telling.
I never thought that a simple swim in the lake could have such dire consequences. It was a hot day, the kind that makes you want to jump into the water to cool off. I remember feeling the shock of the cold water on my overheated skin and the thrill of the plunge as I jumped in. At first, it was just a bit of fun. I splashed around with my friends, laughing and enjoying the refreshing feeling of the water. But then I started to feel sick. My stomach churned, and I felt a strange pain in my lower abdomen. I thought it was just a minor illness, something that would go away on its own. But when the pain didn't go away, I knew I had to do something. I went to the hospital, hoping for a quick fix, but what they found was beyond anything I could have imagined. They diagnosed me with worms in my uterus. The doctors were shocked, and so was I. How could this happen to me? I was just a girl, living my life, not expecting to be invaded by something so sinister. The surgery was long and complicated, with multiple doctors and nurses involved. They had to remove over a dozen worms, each nearly a foot long. It was a gruesome sight, and it made me sick to my stomach. But even after the worms were removed, I continued to feel sick. My skin became pale and sallow, and I could barely keep any food down. The medical staff struggled to understand the severity of the infestation. They ran countless tests, trying to figure out what was wrong with me. But as the days turned into weeks, my health continued to deteriorate. I felt like I was slowly fading away, consumed by something that was beyond my control. I remember lying in my hospital bed, feeling like I was on the brink of death. I could feel something moving inside me, a writhing mass that clawed at my insides. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then the movements grew more and more intense. It felt like something was trying to claw its way out of me. I screamed, and the nurses rushed in, but it was too late. Something burst out of my uterus, tearing through my flesh like a hot knife through butter. It was a mass of writhing worms, all tangled together in a grotesque, pulsating ball. The sight was enough to make even the most experienced medical professionals gag in horror. The worms continued to writhe and twist, slowly expanding and contracting as they consumed my body. The doctors tried everything they could think of to stop the worms, but they were like nothing anyone had ever seen before. They seemed to be invincible, multiplying and growing stronger with each passing moment. As the world struggled to come to terms with the uterine horror, I knew that my fate was sealed. The worms had consumed me, body and soul, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. The surgery was a blur of bright lights, beeping machines, and hushed whispers. I remember being wheeled into the operating room, surrounded by a team of doctors and nurses, all focused on one goal, removing the worms from my uterus. I tried to stay calm, but the fear was overwhelming. What if they couldn't remove all the worms? What if the worms had already spread to other parts of my body? I knew that the surgery was just the beginning, and that there would be a long road ahead. The surgery itself was long and complicated, with multiple specialists brought in to assist. They worked in silence, their hands moving with precision as they carefully removed each worm. The worms were large and writhing, and I could feel them squirming inside me as they were pulled out. It was a gruesome sight, and I could feel myself growing weaker with each passing moment. But despite the pain and the fear, I knew that the surgery was my only chance at survival. After the worms were removed, I felt a sense of relief. But it was short-lived. My health continued to deteriorate, and the medical staff struggled to understand why. They ran countless tests, trying to figure out what was wrong with me. But nothing seemed to help. I could feel myself slipping away, consumed by something that was beyond my control. The movements inside me grew more and more intense, like something was trying to claw its way out. I knew that something was wrong, but I didn't know what. Then, one day, everything changed. I was lying in my hospital bed, feeling like I was on the brink of death, when I felt something move inside me. It was a strange sensation, like something was trying to escape. I screamed, and the nurses rushed in, but it was too late. Something burst out of my uterus, tearing through my flesh like a hot knife through butter. It was a mass of writhing worms, all tangled together in a grotesque, pulsating ball. The sight was enough to make even the most experienced medical professionals gag in horror. The worms continued to writhe and twist, slowly expanding and contracting as they consumed my body. The doctors tried everything they could think of to stop the worms, but they were like nothing anyone had ever seen before. They seemed to be invincible, multiplying and growing stronger with each passing moment. As my health continued to deteriorate, I knew that my fate was sealed. The worms had consumed me, body and soul, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. The horror didn't end with my surgery. In fact, it was just the beginning. The worms had spread, and soon others in the hospital began to show the same symptoms I had experienced. At first, the medical staff tried to contain the infestation. They set up quarantine zones and donned protective gear, but it was no use. The worms had already spread, infecting more and more people with each passing day. As the situation worsened, the hospital became a war zone. Doctors and nurses fought desperately to control the infestation, but it continued to spread and multiply at an alarming rate. It wasn't just the hospital that was affected either. The worms had escaped into the world beyond, infecting people in the surrounding area. Soon, the entire city was under siege. The government tried to downplay the situation, calling it a minor outbreak that would be contained soon. But as the days turned into weeks, the situation only grew more dire. People were dying in the streets, consumed by the writhing mass of worms that had invaded their bodies. No one knew how to stop it. The worms were more powerful than anyone could have imagined, mutating and growing stronger with each passing moment. I watched from my hospital bed, consumed by fear and despair. I knew that the worms would never be contained, that they would continue to spread until there was nothing left of humanity. As the death toll continued to rise, the hospital became more and more chaotic. Doctors and nurses were overwhelmed, struggling to keep up with the sheer number of infected patients. And then, one day, the hospital was abandoned. The medical staff simply couldn't keep up with the infestation. They fled, leaving behind a trail of destruction and horror. As the worms continued to spread, consuming everything in their path, the world struggled to come to terms with the new reality. The uterine horror had changed everything, and no one knew if there was anything that could stop it. In the aftermath of the outbreak, the world was left in chaos. The worms had spread far beyond the hospital, infecting cities and towns across the globe. People were dying in the streets, consumed by the writhing mass of worms that had invaded their bodies. The medical community was overwhelmed, struggling to keep up with the sheer number of infected patients. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to find a cure, but the worms were more powerful than anyone could have imagined. They continued to mutate and grow stronger, spreading at an alarming rate. It seemed like there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. As the death toll continued to rise, the world was plunged into darkness. The government tried to maintain order, but it was no use. Panic and fear had taken hold, and people were turning on each other in a desperate bid for survival. But there were some who refused to give up. Doctors and scientists from around the world banded together, pooling their resources and knowledge to try to find a cure. They worked tirelessly, day and night, experimenting with different treatments and medications. Some sacrificed their lives, exposing themselves to the worms in a desperate bid to understand their behavior. But despite their efforts, the worms continued to spread. They seemed invincible, immune to all forms of treatment. As the situation grew more dire, the medical community was forced to make difficult decisions. Some doctors and nurses sacrificed themselves, trying to contain the infestation and protect others. Others fought to find a cure, risking their lives to understand the worms and find a weakness. And then, finally, after months of experimentation and research, they found it. A combination of drugs and treatments that seemed to weaken the worms, slowing their growth and allowing the body to fight back. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. People began to recover, and the death toll finally started to slow. The battle against the worms had been won, but it had come at a great cost. Entire cities had been decimated, and millions of lives had been lost. As the world struggled to rebuild, people began to wonder if there was anything left to fight for. The uterine horror had changed everything, and no one knew if the world would ever be the same again. The world was forever changed by the uterine horror. Cities had been decimated, economies destroyed, and millions of lives had been lost. But despite the devastation, humanity had managed to survive. People began to rebuild, slowly but surely, picking up the pieces of their shattered lives. The medical community continued to work tirelessly, trying to understand the worms and prevent another outbreak from occurring. Governments around the world established new protocols for dealing with infectious diseases, putting in place strict measures to prevent future outbreaks. But the scars of the uterine horror ran deep. People were still afraid, still haunted by the memories of the outbreak. The medical community was still grappling with the aftermath, trying to understand the long-term effects of the worms on the human body. And then, one day, something strange began to happen. People who had been infected with the worms started to report strange, almost supernatural abilities. Some could move objects with their minds, while others could see into the future. At first, people were skeptical, dismissing the reports as fanciful thinking. But as more and more people came forward with their stories, it became clear that something strange was happening. The medical community was baffled, unable to explain the sudden appearance of these abilities. But some speculated that the worms had somehow altered the human DNA, giving people extraordinary powers. And then, the world was plunged into chaos once again. People with these newfound abilities were feared and hunted, their powers seen as a threat to the established order. Governments scrambled to contain the situation, setting up task forces to track down and detain those with abilities. But it was no use. The people with powers were too strong, too numerous. A new world had emerged, one where those with powers held all the cards. It was a world of fear and uncertainty, where the only thing that mattered was survival. As I looked out at this new world, I couldn't help but wonder if it was all worth it. The uterine horror had changed everything, but had it been for the better? As I contemplated the future, I realized that only time would tell. The world was forever changed, and only the strong would survive.